Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lorne Risley. I'm the host of the Halcyon podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for taking time out of your very, very busy schedules to sit and listen to me ramble incoherently for up to 20 minutes. New format going forward on every podcast, every single week. It'll either be a sports-related podcast or it'll be a current events-related podcast. So you'll know what you're getting yourselves in for before you tune in. So you know which ones to avoid when I'm starting to get serious about controversial shit that's probably going to get me into trouble down the line for some politically incorrect business. But you'll be relieved to hear on this occasion we're just going to be talking about plain, old-fashioned, good, wholesome sports. Just covering a variety of different topics, seeing as this evening is the Elimination Chamber for the WWE. Arsenal, I believe, are playing a little bit later on today, albeit maybe I'm lying. It looks like I might be lying. I don't see any sports. See, this is the kind of preparation that I've become renowned with, ladies and gentlemen. But anyway, as far as football is concerned, we'll get to that in a minute. Boxing had an interesting matchup yesterday. George Groves versus Chris Eubank Jr., which ended in defeat for Chris Eubank Jr. by way of a points decision, unanimous. A fight that didn't suit him in the first place, but again, in typical hype fashion, people gave him a chance because he's Chris Eubank Jr. And now the plug's being pulled on him effectively. People saying he's an average boxer, yada, yada, yada. We'll get to that. The UFC, they're starting to ramp up for a couple of main events over the course of the next month and a half that, on paper at least, seem to be leading towards the big Conor payoff down the line. As far as tonight is concerned, you've got Donald Cerrone versus Medeiros. In April, though, we've got the fight I'm most looking forward to at the moment, beyond Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic. I don't think they're unifying the titles, it's just to see, it's champion versus champion, who's the best. And considering that Daniel Cormier DC has competed at heavyweight and light heavyweight and has been successful in both categories, it promises to be an exceptional fight. So let's get things started a little closer to home with the British sports, i.e. the boxing match. George Groves, Chris Eubank Jr. George Groves has kind of built up a reputation since the retirement of Carl Froch for being a very effective boxer. Not the most spectacular of fighters, but nevertheless someone who invokes quite a lot of intrigue because of the character that he is. But Chris Eubank Jr., it could be argued, is still skating on his father's legacy, irrespective of what he tries to say. I think, though, this fight has done an irreparable amount of damage to that moniker of being up on the level of someone like Gennady Golovkin, who he was calling out not too long ago. I think where he goes from here, I think personally he has to drop back down in weight and refine himself just that little bit more. He's only 28 years old, so he's still got a couple of years left before he really hits his peak. I think most people expect people to be in their prime at 28, 29, whereas with boxers, you don't really hit your actual prime until you're 31, 32 years old. You see fighters going up to 36 regularly these days. So I don't worry for him in the sense, I think a lot of people are being a bit harsh by saying he's an average fighter. His hand speed is great, his footwork, his combinations are good. I think he's just a bit too static for his own good, especially in the latter rounds when he drops his hands a bit too frequently. And in this occasion, he was just fighting against a bigger guy. George Groves is the naturally bigger fighter. He knows how to outpoint people. He also knows how to avoid big punches. He doesn't have the reputation considering the knockout blow he suffered with Froch, but people forget that knockout punch would have put anyone on their asses, heavyweights included. It was probably the sweetest knockout punch I've seen live in a long time. But as far as George Groves is concerned, the big story with him is that he's hurt his shoulder, potentially pulled or maybe even dislocated it, depending on what kind of damage he's suffered. There's a title eliminator final, I believe, that he was due to compete in, but it's looking shaky as to whether or not he'll be able to make the fight. So you're going to have to watch the space on that one. I think the big thing with boxing at the moment is that the British divisions have the world's attention, which is fantastic. It's an excellent advert for the skills that this country possesses pugilistically. See, that was hard to say. That kind of tell you all you need to know about the fact that George Groves, Chris Eubank Jr., Amir Khan, Kell Brook, even though he's gone a little bit quiet, David Haye, Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, even to an extent Dillian White, all of these fighters, and that's not to mention the Smiths, there's probably a few others I'm forgetting, the divisions that the British the British fighters occupy at the moment are all the most engrossing because of the British fighters. The problem is, and I think people don't really understand this, is that skill-wise, I think we're still a little bit further behind, especially when you look at the South Americans. You get a lot of Latino fighters that I believe possess a tremendous amount of skill and toughness that British boxers hope to equal but never quite do. And obviously you've got the uprising in the Russian contingent, the Slovakian contingent, the Czech contingent, the Kazakh contingent, all of those sort of Eastern European countries. They produce some absolutely top class fighters. But with the rematch between Saul Canelo and Gennady Golovkin, boxing as a whole is starting to look up, which is excellent news given the aftermath of the Mayweather-McGregor fight, which promised to almost usher an end to any big stars for a while. Because I think most people they might argue me on this point, but I genuinely believe that the reason why people were banking so heavily on that fight is because they genuinely think there's no big fights out there. The Canelo Alvarez fight versus Golovkin is the one I was more excited for as a fan of boxing than Mayweather-McGregor, but the Mayweather-McGregor fight is the most intriguing of the two. I think what's interesting now is that this new raft of fighters, so you've got your British contingent, you've got the South American contingent, the Mexicans, the Eastern Europeans, they all threaten to be overshadowed by the fact that Floyd Mayweather is potentially looking at coming into the MMA ring. Now, I think at this point it's important to stress it's all fluster at this point. It's all Twitter feeds and Snapchat filters and all the rest of this jazz. 10-second video of him standing there rubbing his hands together isn't enough for me to get excited about the prospect of him fighting legitimately in MMA yet. And add to that the prospect that people are trying to tell me that there's the distinct chance that CM Punk, Phil Brooks of former WWE fame, might be his competitor, not Conor McGregor for his first fight, given the relative skill levels of the two fighters. And people, if they believe that, I think they need to look at the situation as a whole before they get too excited, because number one, the amount of money that Floyd Mayweather is talking about earning with the UFC at the moment is frankly preposterous, because the UFC do not generate that kind of level of interest. The crossover is very, very minimal. I think a lot of boxing fans would struggle to get into the MMA style of thinking because it's just a different type of combat sport. It's difficult to really articulate unless you've watched an MMA fight versus a boxing match. But if you've never seen an MMA fight, just that sense of danger is always there, even on the ground when they're clinched up. Whereas in boxing, when you're clinching up, you're effectively safe. There's not a lot that someone can do from that kind of range and distance, unless you're Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch master, in which case, fair enough, you should be world champion if you can get that technique off. But I think the interesting thing about that situation, generally speaking, is where Conor plays into the equation, because Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson, they're going to be competing for effectively the right to face Conor McGregor. Even if they strip Conor McGregor, he will probably walk back into the title scene at some stage and down the line in the next year or so. I don't think his fighting days are over. It's just a question of the kind of money that he'd command and the kind of fight that he'd want to take in terms of prestige and in terms of cementing his legacy coming off the back of a loss to Floyd Mayweather. And having obviously secured his financial future, you would hope. As far as the UFC is concerned, though, I would probably advocate of the fights that I'm excited for at the moment. I know more about Stipe Miocic and Daniel Cormier, having followed them a little bit more closely. I would also recommend, again this is a recommendation, if you're not into UFC, the best person to maybe follow first is a gentleman by the name of Chael Sonnen, a current fighter for Bellator, not UFC. They're two different organizations, and he has some of the most articulate input that you could ever see. Now you have to bear in mind, I will add a proviso, he is an entertainer he's a promoter sort of by nature. So you have to take into account that he's always trying to present you with something that's a bit eye-catching and not necessarily seeded in 100% truth, as much as he might like to proffer otherwise. But he's an excellent analyst. His YouTube channel, You're Welcome. He has various videos. He does entire podcasts, but now he's sort of coming into my feed more for short stints of videos, i.e. 5 minutes long, little bite-sized chunks that you can digest quite quickly. So I'd highly recommend, if you want to start looking at the MMA scene as a whole, he would be a great starting point for anyone who's a novice to get invested or to get hyped for certain bouts. But the ones I would recommend people get invested in for now, because they promise to be great fights, are Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson versus Daniel Cormier, DC versus Stipe Miocic for their respective titles. So that's boxing and MMA out of the way. I will just stop at this point and just say, look, if anyone actually is into these sports, I love debating, I love talking about it, I love getting a hype with these things. So please, in the comment section, leave me your thoughts on what you think is interesting or noteworthy, or something that's worth getting hyped about, or something that you've seen that you think is being misappropriated about the sport, because I love learning about these things, especially since MMA is sort of a new thing to me. Boxing, I have a reasonable idea of the heritage and the standing and things like that to make predictions on things, but the MMA I'm still getting into, because there is a distinction between the UFC and Bellator, and again, I'm struggling to come to terms with that at the moment because there's a lot to take in. So, moving on, and this is the part of the podcast where everyone has, if they haven't switched off, they probably will. It's the Elimination Chamber, WWE. I think the biggest controversy at the moment is the fact that they increased the number of competitors in the Elimination Chamber from 6 to 7. It doesn't really make much sense. I think at the moment, this is just a feeling I have, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think a lot of the matches, the matchups, a lot of the situations that they're getting themselves into now are not the ideal first situations. I think a lot of these matchups are, let's put it this way. At the moment, Nakamura and AJ Styles is the match I want to see most. But there's not really a tremendous story behind it, except for all the stuff that happened in New Japan, the anticipation leading up to it, but there's no why, really, to get involved and invested. Sami Zayn versus Kevin Owens, that's probably going to be slated for WrestleMania, but we've seen the match twice before. Brock Lesnar versus Roman Reigns is a probable bet, and again, we've seen that once before, and this time there's no money in the bank to save the main event, assuming that it's shite. And then there's still the question of Ronda Rousey's involvement. So I think the problem is that, from my perspective, you look at it as being, well, it's unpredictable. Anything could happen. And I go, yes, but if the fans don't understand the thread and they can't pull on the thread, they can't get invested. It's the reason why most people struggle to understand certain films and struggle to like them for what they are. I'll give you a classic example. Revolver, the film, I think it's a Guy Ritchie film with Jason Statham. I have no idea what's going on in that film, and I've watched it 3 or 4 times and read the Wikipedia page with people to help me understand exactly what hell's going on. I still have no idea, which means it's hard to get invested in the characters, the situations, the motives, irrespective of how well it's executed, how well it's been shot, how well it's been acted. You spend your time questioning why. So I worry at the moment, they still have time. There's still 6 weeks effectively between now and WrestleMania, a little bit less than that. They've still got to figure out Kurt Angle's involvement, whether or not he's going to wrestle, potentially Triple H. They've got to figure out what they're doing with Braun Strowman. Elias, he's now becoming more and more of a mainstay as on top of the card. John Cena, is he going to be at Mania? Undertaker, is he going to be Mania? Who's going to be the star of the show? Is there going to be a returning element at all? It's shaping up to be interesting, let's put it that way. And I think the Elimination Chamber will give us an idea of where we're going now, because from that point onwards, because the Rumble's over. That's usually the staging point, but I think now sometimes, because of the distance between the two shows, between Rumble and Mania, there's so much that happens between now and then because people's opinions fluctuate week to week about whether or not they like something or someone. It's too far in advance. I think the Elimination Chamber is just that close enough that people can start to think about the outcomes and things of that nature a bit more seriously. So I, for one, am intrigued by the Elimination Chamber. If nothing else, that it's going to give us a great idea as to where we're going over the next couple of weeks leading up to Mania. I think we all can agree, though, the women's match for Mania is probably the most intriguing because it has the most story behind it, depending on what they do with Ronda and Asuka. You've got two champions in Charlotte and, oh gosh, I've forgotten her name now. It's gone. It's escaped out of my head, and it's the saddest thing because she is unbelievably gorgeous. It's a goddamn name. 5 Feet of Fury. It's in there somewhere. Nope, it's not coming out. It's going to hit me before the end of the podcast, I guarantee it. But that element has more investment from me than anything else. And given the fact that they've returned the Shield, they've reunited part of the club, Bullet Club, I should say, and yet they don't seem to be doing anything with either one of those elements because of injuries to Ambrose and Reigns. They seem to be stuttering towards WrestleMania story-wise. Hopefully everyone will be fit, everyone will be healthy for the event itself, which means that match-wise they should still be able to put on some decent matches, but at this point it's touch and go as to whether or not it'll actually be a memorable event. I will say one thing though, that logo. I mean, I've designed some crap logos in my time, and I get that it's supposed to be playing off of the New Orleans, the symbol that I know is on the Saints' jerseys. But purple and green? Really? Really, though? Okay, fair enough. Well, yeah, it looks terrible to me, but that's Thursday, April the 5th. That's when it starts. The event itself is actually on Sunday, April. Imagine being there, 3 days of wrestling. That's a lot. That's a lot of wrestling, even for me. So, into the final segment of the podcast. Let's just talk about a couple of teeny tiny things just to get us over the line. Like I say, no more than 20 minutes you'll be happy to hear, so just bear with me a few more moments, people. Football. West Bromwich Albion are going from strength to strength at the moment in terms of being terrible. I think at the moment that the story that's going to be following around is this taxi thing, but that will go with time. I think it's interesting the fact that they let one of the players play and give him the captaincy, but bench the others. So I don't know. It's until all of the facts come out, it's difficult to make the judgment. But as far as I'm concerned, as a football fan at the moment, as an Arsenal fan, we had a great result against Östersunds, I think their name, or Östersunds, or how it's pronounced. In Sweden, 3-0 result without really an out-and-out sharp striker. Danny Welbeck deputised as best as he could, but I think it's fair to say he doesn't look match fit at the moment. However, the game that we really need to be focusing on here, and the game that I'm glad we're coming into it with just a bit of form, is the Carabao Cup final. City. I think we're getting him at a good time. I genuinely think that if we're going to beat City for a cup, this is going to be it. If we can inflict a loss to City to deny them a cup, given that they don't have a lot of players at the moment at their disposal, considering they're dealing with a couple of injuries, which for us, Lacazette, I think, is the only main one that we're concerned about. Ramsey might not be fit, but again, you've got Wilshere who can play a similar role, so it's not that concerning. You've got Aubameyang, Mkhitaryan, Ozil, all fit. The defence, broadly speaking, all fit as well. So I think from an Arsenal perspective, I think we go into this match with a degree of hope, even with the disappointing result of Spurs. That was a terrible game. I think from an Arsenal perspective, we should have done a lot better given the attacking force we put out there, but you can't help sometimes. It's just not your night. I will say one thing though. I think I want to be a Rihanna fan now, because goddamn, she turns up and we absolutely have a scorcher of a game, and she's on the pitch, she's playing about. I mean, I've got to be honest, if you're going to have an Arsenal fan, it might as well be Rihanna, because she is just so fine. It's better than having Jay-Z, even though I think Jay-Z's an Arsenal fan. I think it's I think it's John Cena who's a Spurs fan. I can't remember anyone else on the top of my head. Pixie Lott, I think, is a West Ham fan. You've also got Beyonce, who I think is something like a bloody Cardiff fan or something, I don't know. But the fact that we've got Riri with the Gunners, hey, it's a good time to be an Arsenal fan from that perspective. You never know. So, I think that about does it. Sports-wise, we've covered everything that I wanted to cover. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast and this rambling, incoherent summation of everything that's going on with football, UFC, MMA, WWE, and everything in between, boxing as well. So thank you very much for listening. Please like, share, subscribe. Please check out some of the other content that in the description below from the content creators. Check out some of my other videos that I've released recently. I'm putting my heart and soul into these videos. Latest one has taken me about 7 or 8 hours to edit just because I wanted to get it as good as possible, and I guarantee it's going to be pulled for copyright within about, I will say, 13 seconds. So watch this space for that. In the meantime, I hope you guys are taking care of yourselves. I hope you have a great week, whatever you do. I hope to catch you Wednesday when the latest episode of Halcyon drops. It's likely to be a blink or a top 5 list, so I hope you enjoy it in either event. I hope you've caught Black Panther. You're going to message me and tell me what you think about it. If you caught anything else recently, I hope you message me and get me involved. And I hope that if there's anything that you think I should be covering right now, if there's anything you'd like me to get my opinion on, or do a video on, or come and join me and do a video on, you better DM me, inbox me, text me, call me, and let me know immediately so we can get it sorted. So, once again, I've been your host, Lorne Risley. This has been the Halcyon Podcast, touching on the sports. Next week, it's going to be a more serious topic, so feel free to give that one a miss if you don't fancy getting annoyed. And in the meantime, please take care of yourselves, have a great week, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Halcyon Podcast.